Have you ever faced a betrayal so deep, so cutting that you yearned for more than just an apology? Have you ever witnessed power stolen, dignity trampled, or loved ones destroyed and felt a cold fire ignite within you demanding retribution? What happens when that raw desire for vengeance courses through the veins of a woman who wears a crown, a queen with the might of kingdoms at her command? From the icy grip of early medieval Kiev and Rus to the sun-drenched battlefields of medieval Spain and the treacherous courts of France, these queens did not just dream of revenge. They meticulously crafted it, executing precision that left a lasting mark on history. These are the shocking stories from the medieval era. Number 7. Olga of Kiev's fiery retribution. The year was 945. The Drevlians, a Slavic tribe living to the west of Kiev and Rus, had made a grave error. They had murdered Prince Igor of Kiev, husband of Princess Olga, and father to their young son, Sviatoslav. Igor had been attempting to collect tribute, a tax of furs and honey from the Drevlians, who had long resisted his authority. When Igor, dissatisfied with the initial payment, attempted to demand more, the Drevlians seized him. According to ancient chronicles, they bent 2 birch trees to the ground, tied Igor's legs to them, then released the trees, tearing the prince apart in a gruesome display of defiance. News of this brutal act traveled swiftly across the forests and rivers, to Kiev, where Olga now sat as regent for her 3-year-old son. The Drevlians, far from fearing reprisal, saw an opportunity. They decided to solidify their power and assimilate the Kievan lands by proposing a marriage between their prince, Mao, and the newly widowed Olga. The Drevlian envoys, 20 men strong, arrived in Kiev, announcing their proposal. They spoke of Igor's folly and Prince Mao's wisdom, suggesting that Olga should become their queen. Olga, however, was not one to be easily swayed or to forget a profound insult. Her face remained composed, a mask hiding the simmering fury within her. She listened to their propositions with an unnerving calm, a serene smile playing on her lips. She feigned acceptance, stating that their offer was pleasing to her. She told the envoys to return to their boats, which they had pulled ashore, and await her summons. She promised them a grand and honorable reception the following day, a testament to their high standing and the importance of their proposal. The Drevlian envoys, puffed with pride and confident in their success, settled into their boats, believing their scheme had succeeded. They did not know the chilling depths of Olga's grief or the cold calculation of her mind. The next morning, Olga sent a message to the Drevlian envoys, inviting them to her court for their promised grand reception. She stipulated, however, that they must arrive in their boats carried by the people of Kiev. The Drevlians, interpreting this as a sign of extraordinary respect and a clear signal of Olga's acceptance of their proposal, agreed readily. They permitted the Kievan villagers who had been commanded by Olga to carry their boats with the envoys still inside into the city. The men were borne through the streets, likely amidst a crowd of curious onlookers, until they reached the ducal courtyard. At the center of the courtyard, Olga had had a deep, wide trench dug overnight, a pit that seemed to stretch into the earth. It was a detail the envoys had not noticed as they were carried triumphant through the city. The men carrying the boats, acting under Olga's specific instructions, carried the Drevlian vessels and their occupants directly to the edge of this massive pit. Without warning, they tipped the boats, sending the 20 proud envoys tumbling into the deep trench below. From her vantage point, Olga surveyed the scene. She then approached the edge of the pit, and with an expression devoid of sympathy, asked the Drevlian envoys if they found their honor to their liking. Before they could fully comprehend the trap, Olga ordered her servants to bury the envoys alive. The earth was shoveled over the screaming, struggling men, layer after layer, until the pit was filled, their cries slowly fading into muffled gasps, and then into silence. This was the first brutal act of her retribution, a clear message to the Drevlians of the fate awaiting those who dared to disrespect Kiev's ruling family. But Olga's thirst for justice, or perhaps revenge, was far from sated. The Drevlians, oblivious to the horrific fate of their first delegation, sent a second group of envoys to Kiev. They arrived eager for news to press their suit. Olga, with the same deceptive composure, received them. This time she instructed them to wash themselves in the public bathhouse before they met with her. It was a gesture of hospitality, a cleansing ritual before entering the presence of a powerful ruler. The Drevlian envoys, unaware of the treachery that had befallen their predecessors, readily agreed. They entered the wooden bathhouse, stripping off their clothes, eager for the warm water and steam after their journey. As the second group of Drevlian envoys enjoyed the bath, Olga's soldiers, acting on her precise orders, locked the bathhouse doors from the outside. They then piled timber around the structure and set it ablaze. The wooden building, dry and brittle, caught fire rapidly, the flames licking hungrily at its walls. The Drevlian envoys, trapped inside, initially confused, soon realized the horrific reality of their situation. Their joyous anticipation turned to terror as the smoke thickened and the heat became unbearable. Their desperate screams and frantic pounding against the doors were clearly audible to the Kievan guards standing outside, but no mercy was shown. The bathhouse, along with the Drevlian envoys, trapped within, burned to the ground, leaving nothing but charred remains. The second act of retribution was even more public, a fiery testament to Olga's determination. The Drevlians had sent 2 delegations to marry her. She had consumed them both. Olga was still not finished. She sent a message to the Drevlians, stating that she was finally coming to them to their city of Iskorosten, the place where her husband Igor had been murdered. She announced that she desired to hold a funeral feast at Trezna at Igor's grave, in accordance with Slavic tradition. The Drevlians, despite the unexplained silence from their 2 delegations, perhaps desperate to secure an alliance with Kiev, prepared for her arrival. A large contingent of Drevlians gathered to meet her, many of them involved in Igor's killing. They welcomed her, and she, appearing to mourn deeply, requested that they prepare a large amount of mead, a traditional alcoholic beverage, for the funeral feast. The Drevlians, eager to show their hospitality and secure their future queen, Olga and her small retinue joined the feast, and as the day progressed, she encouraged the Drevlians to drink deeply, ensuring they became thoroughly intoxicated. The mead flowed freely, and soon many of the Drevlian warriors and elders were in a stupor, their guard completely down. At a pre-arranged signal, Olga's loyal soldiers, who had been waiting soberly amongst the drunken Drevlians, suddenly attacked. They moved swiftly and mercilessly, cutting down the inebriated Drevlians by the thousands. According to historical accounts, over 5,000 Drevlians were slain that day, their bodies littering the ground around Igor's grave. It was a massacre, a brutal purging of the Drevlian leadership and warriors, a chillingly efficient extermination of those who had participated in her husband's death. But even after this devastating slaughter, Olga's revenge had one more stage to complete: the Drevlian capital of Iskorosten. The very city where Igor had been killed now stood largely undefended, its leaders and warriors decimated by Olga's treachery. Olga returned to Kiev, gathered a large army, and launched a full-scale siege against Iskorosten. The city, weakened and demoralized, held out for a year, but eventually their resistance faltered. Olga, however, did not storm the city or demand its immediate surrender. Instead, she offered them a seemingly lenient peace. She told the surviving Drevlians that she was tired of the siege and desired only a small tribute from them, a symbolic gesture of submission. She asked for 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house. The Drevlians, desperate and exhausted by the siege, agreed without hesitation. Relieved at the seemingly trivial demand, they gathered the birds and presented them to Olga, believing their ordeal was finally over. Olga accepted the birds. Her eyes, however, held a cold, calculating gleam. She instructed her soldiers to tie a piece of sulfur, or a small piece of cloth soaked in oil, to the leg of each bird. As night fell, Olga's forces released the birds. Pigeons and sparrows, disoriented and driven by instinct, flew back to their nests within the city, to their homes. Moments later, the night sky over Iskorosten lit up. The sulfur-soaked rags, ignited by Olga's command, set fire to the wooden roofs and haystacks of the city's houses. The flames spread rapidly, engulfing the entire city in a massive conflagration. The Drevlians, waking to find their homes ablaze, rushed out in terror, fleeing the inferno. As they streamed out of the burning city, they were met by Olga's waiting soldiers, who either captured them or cut them down. Those who escaped the fires and the soldiers were sold into slavery. The city of Iskorosten was utterly destroyed, leaving nothing but ashes and memories. Olga's retribution was complete. Every Drevlian who had touched her husband or dared to challenge Kiev's rule had been eliminated, crushed, or enslaved, their capital a smoldering ruin. Her revenge, meticulously planned and executed in 4 brutal stages, echoed through the annals of history, a chilling testament to the wrath of a princess wronged. Number 6. Isabella of France's royal retribution. The year is 1326. England is a kingdom simmering with discontent, its throne occupied by King Edward II, a monarch whose reign was increasingly seen as disastrous. At the heart of this royal turmoil was Hugh Despenser, the younger, the king's current favorite, a man whose insatiable greed and arrogance had alienated every lord and commoner in the realm. Despenser, with his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had effectively seized control of the government, wielding immense power, enriching himself, and persecuting anyone who stood in their path. Queen Isabella of France, a woman of formidable will and sharp intellect, found herself increasingly mortalized, her lands confiscated, her children threatened, and her husband the king. Utterly infatuated with Despenser, seemingly blind to the ruin he brought upon the kingdom, Isabella, daughter of the powerful French king Philip IV, had been married to Edward II for 19 years. Their early marriage had been strained by Edward's clear preference for his male companions, most notably Piers Gaveston, whom Isabella had come to despise. Gaveston's execution in 1312, carried out by a confederation of powerful barons, had brought only temporary relief. The Despensers had emerged more cunning and rapacious than Gaveston to fill the void. Isabella, increasingly desperate, had been sent to France in 1325 on a diplomatic mission to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother King Charles IV. It was a journey that would change the course of English history and seal the fate of her husband and his favorite. While in France, Isabella made a decision that shocked the courts of Europe. She refused to return to England unless Despenser the Younger was removed from power. This was a bold and unprecedented move for a medieval queen. She became a magnet for English exiles, disgruntled nobles, and those who harbored deep resentments against Despenser's tyranny. Among them was Roger Mortimer, a powerful martyred lord who had been imprisoned by Edward II and Despenser only to escape to France. Mortimer, a man of ambition and considerable military skill, quickly became Isabella's closest ally, and it was widely believed her lover. Their relationship, scandalous in its time, cemented an alliance of 2 powerful figures, united by a common enemy. Together, they began to plan their invasion. A desperate gamble for the throne and for a bloody reckoning. The invasion force, though small, landed at Harwich on the Suffolk coast in September 1326, the site of Queen Isabella, a beloved figure to many, leading the charge against her tyrannical husband and his reviled favorite, sparked an immediate and widespread uprising. Support for Isabella and Mortimer swelled as they marched through the countryside. English nobles and knights who had suffered under Despenser's rule flocked to their banner. Edward II and Despenser, caught completely by surprise, found themselves isolated, their support crumbling around them. King, accustomed to a court that bowed to his whims, was utterly unprepared for the swift and overwhelming tide of rebellion. Edward and Despenser fled westward, attempting to gather loyal forces, but their efforts were futile. Town after town, castle after castle, declared for Isabella. The Despensers, now hunted men, were desperate. Edward II himself, abandoning the royal treasury and crown jewels, became a fugitive. The elder Despenser, Hugh Despenser the Elder, was captured first. At Bristol, a city that had long chafed under his oppressive hand, he was immediately put on trial by Mortimer. The accusations against him were numerous: theft, extortion, rebellion, and disloyalty. The trial was swift, brutal, and without mercy. Found guilty, the elder Despenser, a man of 80 years, was dragged to the gallows. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body dismembered, a gruesome public spectacle that signaled a new order. The crowd cheered their long-suppressed hatred, erupting in a wave of vengeful joy. Meanwhile, Edward II and Hugh Despenser the Younger, accompanied by a handful of loyalists, were eventually cornered and captured in Wales in mid-November. Their capture brought immense relief across England. But it was Despenser the Younger, the man most hated, who was singled out for Isabella's most elaborate and brutal retribution. He was brought to Hereford, the very heart of Mortimer's power base. His trial was a mere formality. Isabella and Mortimer had no intention of allowing him a defense. He was condemned as a traitor, a thief, and a sodomite, among other charges. The sentence pronounced was one of the most agonizing and humiliating forms of execution known. Public hanging, drawing, and quartering, with an added layer of torment. On November 24, 1326, the scaffold was erected, and a massive crowd gathered to witness Despenser's final moments. He was dragged through the streets, enduring the curses and jeers of the populace. His execution began with him being stripped naked, then paraded before the jeering crowd. He was then forced to wear a tabard, a coat emblazoned with the royal arms, but reversed. A symbol of his treason accounts from chroniclers detail the horrific process. First, he was hanged from a gallows but cut down while still alive. Then his intestines were pulled out and burned before his very eyes. This was followed by castration. His genitalia likewise burned. The crowd roared with a mixture of horror and satisfaction. Finally, his body was dismembered, his head sent to London as a warning, and his quarters distributed to 4 different towns. The sheer cruelty of the execution was designed to be a complete and utter degradation, a mirror of the humiliation and suffering Despenser had inflicted upon others. It was Isabella's ultimate act of vengeance, a public annihilation of the man who had ruined her life and her kingdom. But what of the king? Edward II was not executed immediately. Isabella understood the delicate balance of power. Fratricide, even of a universally reviled king, was a dangerous precedent. Instead, Edward was forced to formally abdicate the throne in favor of his son, Edward III. This was a carefully orchestrated maneuver designed to give legitimacy to the new regime. The king, now a prisoner, was moved from castle to castle, his fate uncertain. However, Isabella and Mortimer knew that as long as Edward II lived, he remained a potential rallying point for opposition. His continued existence was a threat to their newfound power. The end came for Edward II in September 1327 at Berkeley Castle. Precise details of his death have been debated for centuries, shrouded in secrecy and rumor. What is widely accepted is that Isabella and Mortimer ordered his elimination. The official story was that he died of natural causes, a sudden illness. However, chroniclers and contemporary accounts, often written years later, whisper of a more sinister end, a gruesome murder designed to leave no outward marks. It was said that a red-hot poker was thrust into his bowels, a method of internal execution chosen to ensure no external wounds would be visible, thus preventing accusations of murder. This brutal, calculated act, even if not fully verifiable in its horrific details, cakes the ruthlessness with which Isabella secured her power and ensured that her former tormentor could never again threaten her or her son. The she-wolf of France had silenced her enemies, securing her rule through a chilling combination of political skill and brutal vengeance. Number 5. Fredegond's murderous reign. The Merovingian era, the 6th century, in Frankish Gaul was a time of brutal power, struggles, shifting loyalties, and endless blood feuds. The heart of this volatile period was Fredegond, Queen of Neustria, wife Fredegund was not born to royalty. She began her life as a servant in the household of Chilperic's first wife, Audovera. But Fredegund possessed an ambition as vast and as cold as the northern plains, and a ruthless cunning that would see her climb to power over a pile of bodies, many of them orchestrated by her own vengeful hand. Her story is a tapestry woven with threads of jealousy, betrayal, and a relentless pursuit of power, marked by a series of chilling acts of retribution. Fredegund's first target for removal was Audovera, Chilperic's first wife. Fredegund, charming and manipulative, slowly captivated Chilperic, eroding his affections for Audovera. According to the chronicler Gregory of Tours, a key source for this period, Fredegund exploited Audovera's perceived carelessness. One Easter, when Chilperic was absent, Audovera allowed her daughter Theochild to act as godmother to her own younger brother, the infant Merovec. This was a forbidden act according to canon law, which considered it a form of spiritual incest that invalidated the children's legitimacy. When Chilperic returned, Fredegund, feigning shock and piety, reported Audovera's transgression to him. Chilperic, influenced by Fredegund, and perhaps looking for an excuse, immediately repudiated Audovera, sending her and her children to a convent. The path was cleared for Fredegund to become Chilperic's mistress. This calculated maneuver was her first step, a swift removal of a rival who stood between her and the king. However, Chilperic was not yet entirely hers. He soon married a Visigothic princess, Galswintha, sister of Queen Brunhilda of Austrasia. Galswintha brought with her a considerable dowry, and more importantly, a powerful alliance. Fredegund, relegated to the role of mistress, seethed with jealousy and a renewed desire for power. The presence of Galswintha, a legitimate queen, was an unbearable affront to her ambition. Within a year of her marriage to Chilperic, Galswintha was found strangled in her bed. While Chilperic officially blamed a servant, it was widely suspected that Fredegund was behind the murder. Gregory of Tours openly states that Chilperic was incited by Fredegund to commit this heinous act, though he does not explicitly accuse Fredegund of the physical deed. Regardless, Galswintha's removal paved the way for Fredegund to finally become Chilperic's queen. This act, the murder of a rival queen, plunged the Frankish kingdoms into decades of brutal internecine warfare, as Galswintha's sister Brunhilda swore a blood feud against Fredegund, a vendetta that would consume their lives and their kingdoms. Fredegund's reign as queen was marked by relentless suspicion and the swift, brutal elimination of anyone she perceived as a threat or who incurred her wrath. Chilperic had several sons from his first marriage to Audovera: Tudebert, Merovec, and Clovis. These legitimate sons, particularly Merovec, who briefly married Brunhilda, represented a threat to the succession of any future children Fredegund might bear. Fredegund, determined to secure the throne for her own offspring, systematically targeted them. Theudebert was killed in battle, likely encouraged by Chilperic, but Merovec and Clovis met fates more directly attributed to Fredegund's machinations. Merovec, after his controversial marriage to Brunhilda, Chilperic's sworn enemy, was a marked man. Fredegund, fearing his alliance with Brunhilda and his potential claim to the throne, relentlessly pursued him. Chilperic, manipulated by Fredegund, had Merovec imprisoned. Merovec escaped seeking refuge in a church, but was ultimately caught. According to Gregory of Tours, Fredegund sent assassins to capture him. Merovec, cornered, chose to take his own life rather than fall into Fredegund's hands, begging his own servant to kill him. While not a direct murder by Fredegund's hand, her relentless pursuit and psychological torment drove him to his death. An act of calculated revenge against a perceived rival. Next was Clovis, Chilperic's youngest son from Audovera. Fredegund arranged for Clovis to be accused of an act of violence. He was arrested and held in a villa. Fredegund then had his servants tortured until they confessed to conspiring against Chilperic and herself. With these forced confessions, Clovis was declared a traitor and quickly murdered. His body was then dumped in the River Marne, a final ignominious end. To ensure no remnants of Ottavera's line remained, Fredegund had Ottavera herself dragged from her convent and murdered, effectively wiping out the entire legitimate line of Chilperic's first marriage. These acts were not random. They were part of a chillingly systematic elimination of all who might stand in the way of her own children's succession. Fredegund's ruthless nature extended beyond royal heirs. She was known for her personal vendettas. For example, she sent assassins to murder Bishop Praetextatus of Rouen, a man who had bravely spoken out against her and had reconciled Merovesh and Chilperic. The bishop was celebrating Mass when one of Fredegund's agents stabbed him. As he lay dying, the bishop prophesied Fredegund's own demise. Another target was Chilperic's chamberlain, Sinigisol. Chilperic had ordered Sinigisol to hand over some treasure, but Fredegund, desiring the treasure for herself, accused Sinigisol of theft. She manipulated Chilperic into believing Sinigisol had betrayed him. Sunigisol was subsequently arrested and tortured, eventually succumbing to his injuries. Fredegund then seized the treasure. These acts, driven by a mixture of avarice and a deep-seated desire to punish anyone who defied her, demonstrate her singular brutality. Even her own daughters were not safe from her manipulative nature. When Chilperic fell ill, Fredegund, terrified that if he died she would lose her power and be at the mercy of her enemies, consulted with a sorceress. She accused a series of nobles of bewitching her husband, leading to their torture and execution. She went so far as to offer her own daughters as a sacrifice to the gods, hoping to save Chilperic. While Chilperic survived, 2 of her daughters died of dysentery shortly after. Fredegund, refusing to accept natural causes, accused the royal physicians of poisoning them. She had them tortured and executed, claiming it was revenge for their perceived negligence or malice. This demonstrated her willingness to turn on anyone, even those who served her, if they were perceived as failing her or obstructing her will. Fredegund's final act of ruthless revenge, or perhaps political consolidation, was the murder of her own husband, King Chilperic I. The exact circumstances of Chilperic's death in 584 are debated, but many contemporary accounts point towards Fredegund's involvement. Chilperic was out hunting, and as he dismounted, he was stabbed by an unknown assailant. Some historians believe Fredegund, fearing his wavering loyalty or simply consolidating her power for her infant son, Clothar II, orchestrated the assassination. Gregory of Tours implies her involvement by noting that Fredegund, in her hatred and jealousy, was at the bottom of all the evils. With Chilperic gone, Fredegund became the regent for her young son, and she ruthlessly purged any remaining opposition to her and her son's rule, ensuring her ultimate control over Neustria. Fredegund lived on for several more years, continuing her feud with Brunhilde, though her direct acts of murder lessened as her power became more firmly established. She died in 597, having successfully secured her son's throne through a lifetime of brutal, calculated revenge and political murder. Number 4. Joan of Naples' regal retribution. The year is 1345. Naples, a vibrant and politically complex kingdom in southern Italy, is ruled by Queen Joan I. At just 17 years old, Joan had inherited the throne of Naples and Provence, a vast and rich dominion, upon the death of her grandfather, King Robert the Wise. To solidify her rule and ensure dynastic succession, Joan had been married to her cousin Andrew of Hungary, a prince of the powerful Angevin House of Hungary. Andrew, however, was not content with the title of royal consort. He coveted the full regal power, insisting on being crowned king with the same authority as Joan. This ambition, combined with his Hungarian advisor's arrogance and his own rather brutish nature, deeply offended the Neapolitan nobility and, most critically, Queen Joan herself. A simmering resentment began to build between the young queen and her demanding husband. Andrew's behavior became increasingly intolerable in the refined Neapolitan court. He was perceived as crude, loud, and disrespectful of local customs. He spoke Hungarian in preference to French or Italian, infuriating the Neapolitan court. His Hungarian entourage, often seen as a foreign imposition, further alienated the local nobility, who saw their influence diminishing. Andrew's insatiable demand for absolute power, and his insistence on a full coronation, a move that would effectively strip Joan of her independent authority, reached a fever pitch. Pope Clement VI, the ultimate arbiter in matters of Neapolitan succession, had initially delayed Andrew's coronation, but by September 1345, the papal bull authorizing it was expected to arrive. The moment of Andrew's full ascension to power and Joan's relegation to a mere figurehead was fast approaching. The Neapolitan court faction-ridden intense watched with bated breath. On the night of September 18, 1345, a grim and shocking event unfolded at Aversa, a hunting lodge where the royal couple was staying. The details of what transpired are shrouded in the dark cloak of conspiracy and conflicting testimonies, but the outcome is undeniably clear. King Andrew of Hungary was brutally murdered. Chroniclers of the time, including Giovanni Villani and Domenico da Gravina, give various accounts, but the core narrative is one of a premeditated, chilling act. Andrew, lured from his bed by a false summons, perhaps a messenger claiming an urgent dispatch from Naples, found himself in a trap. He was seized by a group of conspirators, gagged to prevent him from screaming, and then strangled with a silk cord. His body was then thrown from a window landing in the garden below. The murder was not merely a quiet assassination. Andrew's governess, Isabella, who was devoted to him, was sleeping in an adjacent room. She heard the commotion and Andrew's muffled struggles. She rushed to his aid, but arrived too late. She raised the alarm, crying out for help. When the body was discovered in the garden, the scene was one of chaos and terror. A rope ladder which the conspirators had used to escape was left hanging from the window. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of accusations and counter-accusations. Queen Joan was undoubtedly present in the lodge that night. Her involvement, or lack thereof, became the central question that plagued her reign and reputation for decades. Many suspected her complicity, arguing that she stood to gain the most from Andrew's removal, while direct evidence linking her to the murder was elusive and contradictory. The perception of her guilt became deeply ingrained in the popular imagination. The murder of Andrew of Hungary unleashed a torrent of political upheaval and vengeance across Naples. Andrew's elder brother, Louis I of Hungary, a powerful and ambitious monarch, swore vengeance for his brother's death. He accused Joan directly of complicity in the murder, denouncing her as a regicide. He launched a massive military invasion of Naples in 1347, determined to avenge his brother and seize the Neapolitan throne for himself. This invasion, known as the Hungarian War, plunged the kingdom into years of devastating conflict. Louis's forces swept through Italy, laying waste to towns and castles, seeking to punish those responsible for Andrew's death. As Louis advanced, he began to exact a brutal form of justice on those he suspected of involvement in the murder. Charles of Durazzo, a powerful Neapolitan prince and a cousin to Joan and Andrew, who had initially supported Joan and was even present in Aversa the night of the murder, was lured by Louis under false pretenses. Louis, publicly proclaiming that he would investigate the murder and execute those responsible, invited Charles to his court. In Aversa, the very location of the murder, Charles, perhaps believing he could clear his name or secure a favorable position, accepted the invitation. Louis, however, had no intention of a fair trial. Charles was seized, condemned by Louis without formal process, and then executed by decapitation. His body left unburied as a warning. Louis saw this as his first major act of retribution against the Neapolitan nobility for his brother's death, despite Charles's own complex relationship with Andrew. Queen Joan herself fled Naples as Louis's forces approached. She sought refuge in her Provençal territories, eventually making her way to Avignon to appeal to Pope Clement VI, the temporal overlord of Naples. It was a desperate move to clear her name and regain her kingdom. In Avignon, Joan faced a papal inquiry into Andrew's murder. She defended herself vigorously, asserting her innocence, claiming she had been coerced or was unaware of the plot. The exact nature of her defense is debated, but historical accounts indicate she offered a compelling narrative of coercion and duress, perhaps even implying she had been under the influence of powerful factions. The Pope, a man who had his own political reasons for supporting Joan and maintaining the Angevin rule in Naples, eventually acquitted her of direct involvement in the murder. He declared her innocent, or at least not guilty by canonical law, possibly accepting her argument of duress or a lack of direct knowledge. This papal acquittal, however, did little to quiet the suspicions that lingered throughout Europe, especially in Hungary. Despite her acquittal, Joan faced a long and arduous struggle to reclaim her kingdom from Louis of Hungary. She eventually managed to negotiate a peace with Louis, reportedly, by paying him a hefty sum, an act that historians suggest allowed Louis to save face and withdraw his forces, though he never formally renounced his claims. Joan returned to a kingdom ravaged by war, and still deeply divided by the suspicion surrounding Andrew's death. Throughout her long reign, she continued to consolidate her power, often ruthlessly suppressing rebellions and eliminating political rivals who challenged her authority or her claim to the throne. The murder of Andrew of Hungary became a shadow that followed her, forcing her to be ever vigilant, to constantly demonstrate her strength and resolve, and to punish any who dared to question her legitimacy or her power. Her rule, though ultimately lengthy, was defined by the initial, shocking act of regicide and the subsequent desperate, often brutal, Maechal. Maechur. Number 3. Olga of Lyon and Castile's furious reassertion. The early 12th century in the Iberian Peninsula was a crucible of shifting alliances, Christian reconquest, and internal power struggles among the emerging kingdoms. In the heart of this turmoil stood Olga, Queen of Lyon, and Castile. Born in 1081, she was the only legitimate child and heir of King Alfonso VI, one of the most powerful monarchs of his time. Olga inherited a vast and complex realm upon her father's death. In 1109, her reign, however, was far from peaceful. It was characterized by relentless warfare, political intrigue, and a fierce, often brutal reassertion of her own authority against those who sought to control or diminish her power, most notably her second husband, Alfonso the Battler, King of Aragon and Navarre. Her story is one of a queen who fought with cunning military might and a palpable fury against those who sought to usurp her throne and her dignity. Olga's first marriage to Raymond of Burgundy had produced a son, Alfonso Raymondez, who would later become King Alfonso VII. When Raymond died, and then her father Alfonso VI passed away, Olga became queen regnant, facing the immense challenge of ruling a vast kingdom as a woman and fearing potential instability from ambitious nobles. Her father had arranged for her to remarry to Alfonso the Battler, a powerful and aggressive warrior king. This marriage, intended to unite the Christian kingdoms of Leon, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, quickly devolved into a bitter and destructive war. Alfonso the Battler, true to his nickname, was a formidable military leader, but he was also domineering and sought to rule Leon and Castile as his own, sidelining Olga and her son. This attempt at usurpation and his disrespect for her authority ignited Olga's furious resolve. From the moment of their marriage, the relationship between Olga and Alfonso the Battler was a disaster. Alfonso, known for his harsh treatment of women and his disdain for the Castilian and Leonese nobility, immediately asserted his authority, attempting to seize control of Olga's castles and territories. He mistreated Olga, even imprisoning her for a period. This direct assault on her royal dignity and her rightful claim to the throne, coupled with his disrespect for her person, triggered Olga's fierce resistance. She was not a queen to be easily pushed aside. She gathered her own faction of loyal nobles, primarily from Castile, who were equally resentful of Alfonso's Aragonese and Navarrese influence. What followed was a devastating civil war that ravaged the kingdoms for years, fought between husband and wife. The war between Olga and Alfonso the Battler was marked by brutal military engagements and shifting alliances. Olga, proving to be a skilled and resilient military commander in her own right, personally led troops into battle. She fought relentlessly to reclaim her castles and towns from her husband's forces. For example, the city of Palencia, which had been seized by Alfonso the Battler, was subjected to a fierce siege by Urraca's forces. She pressed the attack with unwavering determination, her troops storming the defenses until the city was retaken. This was not merely a military campaign. It was Urraca's personal reassertion of authority, a direct and violent reclamation of what she viewed as rightfully hers. Chroniclers report her presence on the battlefield, rallying her troops, a sight that instilled both fear and admiration. Urraca's wrath was not limited to her husband. Her half-sister Teresa, Countess of Portugal, also posed a significant threat. Teresa, daughter of Alfonso VI and his mistress Jimena Muñoz, had been granted the County of Portugal, and she too harbored ambitions for greater independence, and even a crown. She allied herself with Alfonso the Battler at various times, seeking to destabilize Urraca's rule and expand her own territory. This betrayal from within her own family further fueled Urraca's desire to punish those who defied her. Urraca recognized the existential threat posed by Teresa's separatist ambitions and her alliances with external enemies. In 1116, Urraca led a campaign against Teresa's forces in Portugal. The resulting conflict was fierce, and Urraca's forces were at times met with stiff resistance. However, Urraca, driven by her determination to crush this internal challenge, pressed her attack. She secured a decisive victory against Teresa, forcing her half-sister to acknowledge Urraca's suzerainty. This was a brutal reassertion of familial and royal hierarchy, a clear message that challenges to her authority, even from her own kin, would be met with overwhelming force. The victory, however, did not completely end Teresa's ambitions, and the two half-sisters would continue their struggle for influence in the years that followed, with Urraca consistently asserting her dominance. Urraca's ruthlessness extended to dealing with rebellious nobles within her own kingdom. Power of the Castilian and Leonese nobility was immense, and many lords sought to exploit the civil war between Urraca and Alfonso the Battler for their own gain. Some nobles changed allegiance, frequently supporting whichever side offered the most immediate benefit. Urraca, however, was not one to tolerate disloyalty for long. She relentlessly pursued and punished those who betrayed her or actively worked against her rule. For example, Pedro Froilaz, a powerful Castilian count who often championed her son, Alfonso Raimundez's claims, sometimes in opposition to Urraca herself, found himself alternately allied with and opposed to the Queen. When his actions verged on outright rebellion, Urraca did not hesitate to bring the full force of her royal authority against him. She utilized both military force and political maneuvering to bring recalcitrant nobles to heel. Castles were besieged, lands confiscated, and rebellious lords imprisoned or exiled. Her reassertion of authority was often swift and unforgiving. Her determination to retain control, even amidst the chaos of war, was legendary. Counts describe her as fiercely independent, often defying the expectations of a medieval queen and directly confronting those who sought to undermine her. Her refusal to submit to her husband's domination and her tenacious fight to maintain her own legitimate rule speaks volumes about her unwavering will and her capacity for ruthless action when her power was challenged. Ultimately, after years of devastating warfare, the marriage between Urraca and Alfonso the Battler was formally annulled by the Pope in 1114 on the grounds of consanguinity. However, the fighting between them continued intermittently for several more years as Alfonso refused to relinquish the Castilian territories he had seized. Urraca finally managed to assert complete control over her kingdoms, but it came at a terrible cost of lives and resources. She fought for her throne, her honor, and her son's inheritance with a ferocity that few women of her era could match. Her reign, though tumultuous, ended with her retaining her crown and securing the succession for her son, Alfonso VII. Her relentless fight against her husband, her half-sister, and her rebellious nobility was a continuous act of reassertion and retribution, a vivid testament to a queen who would stop at nothing to defend her realm and her dignity. Number 2. Eleanor of Aquitaine's strategic undermining. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and captivating figures of the Middle Ages, lived a life of extraordinary influence and profound challenge. Born in 1122, Duchess of Aquitaine, and Countess of Poitou in her own right, she was one of the wealthiest and most desirable women in Europe. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France lasted 15 years and produced 2 daughters. However, it was a union marked by personality clashes and the failure to produce a male heir. In 1152, their marriage was annulled, and within months Eleanor made a move that would reshape the map of Europe. She married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who would soon become King Henry II of England. This second marriage created the vast Angevin Empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, and made Eleanor a Queen of England. Yet this union, initially one of great passion and political synergy, would also descend into profound conflict, culminating in what can be seen as Eleanor's strategic and sustained act of revenge against a husband who sought to control and diminish her. The early years of Eleanor's marriage to Henry II were productive. She bore him 8 children, 5 of whom were sons, securing the succession for the nascent Angevin dynasty. Eleanor played a crucial role in the governance of their vast domains, particularly in Aquitaine, her ancestral homeland which she ruled independently. However, as the children grew and Henry's power became absolute, his behavior changed. He was a dynamic, restless, and deeply ambitious ruler, but also autocratic and prone to fits of rage. He took numerous mistresses, most notably Rosamund Clifford, whose presence became an open affront to Eleanor's dignity and status as queen. More significantly, Henry began to curtail Eleanor's influence, attempting to assert his direct control over Aquitaine and limiting her authority. He also withheld from his sons the lands and power they believed were rightfully theirs, a source of growing frustration for both Eleanor and her offspring. The culmination of Henry's repressive policies and his public disrespect for Eleanor led to her most dramatic act of retribution, encouraging and actively participating in her sons' rebellion against their father. By 1173, the simmering discontent among Henry's elder sons, Henry the young King Richard, the future Lionheart, and Geoffrey, reached a boiling point. They felt stifled by their father, denied the power and lands they had been promised. Eleanor, deeply sympathetic to their plight, and herself feeling increasingly marginalized and dishonored by Henry's actions at his public display of affection for his mistress, saw an opportunity for a powerful strategic counterattack. She actively encouraged her sons to rise in rebellion, providing them with financial support, rallying their allies, and using her immense influence to build a formidable coalition against Henry II. This was not a physical act of violence by her own hand, but a calculated, deliberate undermining of her husband's authority and the very foundations of his empire, designed to make him suffer for his perceived betrayals. The Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174 was a massive conflict against his 3 eldest sons, supported by their mother, Queen Eleanor, and backed by Louis VII of France, William the Lion of Scotland, and a host of powerful English and continental barons. Eleanor, based in Poitiers, her capital in Aquitaine, became the heart of the rebellion. She personally encouraged the Aquitanian nobility, who were fiercely loyal to her, to join the uprising. She sent her younger sons Richard and Geoffrey to Louis VII's court for support, and she maintained a constant correspondence with the rebellious factions. This was a direct and deliberate challenge to Henry II's rule, a strategic act of rebellion aimed at forcing him to concede power to his sons and implicitly to restore Eleanor's own standing. This was revenge for the years of slight and marginalization enacted through the hands of her own children. Henry II, a formidable military commander, eventually crushed the rebellion. The revolt, despite its widespread support, was ultimately unsuccessful. Henry moved swiftly and decisively, defeating his enemies on multiple fronts. The consequences for those involved were severe. Many rebellious barons faced forfeiture of their lands and imprisonment. For Eleanor, the price of her involvement was her freedom. In 1174, as she attempted to flee Aquitaine dressed as a man, she was captured by Henry's forces. Her capture sealed her fate. Henry II, furious at her perceived betrayal and her direct role in encouraging his son's rebellion, ordered her imprisonment. Eleanor was kept under house arrest for the next 15 years. Her imprisonment was largely symbolic rather than punitive, in the sense of harsh physical conditions. She was often moved from one royal castle to another, sometimes allowed to attend court, but always under strict supervision, never truly free. This long drawn-out period of confinement, however, was itself a form of cruel revenge on Henry's part. It was a deliberate effort to neutralize her political influence, to prevent her from further undermining his rule, and to break her spirit. For Eleanor, a woman who had reigned as Queen of France and England and ruled vast territories in her own right, this sustained loss of liberty, this constant reminder of her husband's absolute power over her, was a profound and daily humiliation. It was Henry's ruthless answer to her act of strategic rebellion. Yet even in confinement, Eleanor's influence, and perhaps her quiet, determined vengeance, continued to ripple through the Angevin Empire. Her sons, particularly Richard, remained devoted to her and resented their father's treatment of their mother. The seeds of discord that Eleanor had helped sow continued to grow. Henry the young king, her eldest son, died in 1183, but his death did not bring peace. Richard, her favorite son, and Geoffrey continued their struggles against Henry II, often with Eleanor's tacit encouragement from her gilded cage. Henry's later years were plagued by the constant rebellions of his sons, a direct consequence of his initial harsh treatment of them and their mother. It was only upon Henry II's death in 1189 that Eleanor was finally released from her long imprisonment. Her son Richard I ascended the throne, and his first act was to free his mother. Eleanor, now 67 years old, immediately reasserted her power. She played a crucial role in governing England during Richard's absence on crusade and later during his captivity. Her return to power was in itself a form of ultimate victory, a long-delayed revenge against a husband who had sought to bury her influence. She outlived Henry II by 15 years, witnessing the full collapse of the Angevin Empire under her youngest son John A, reign marked by further conflict and discord. Eleanor's strategic undermining of Henry II, her active support of her son's rebellion, and her resilience through long imprisonment stands as a testament to a queen whose desire for retribution was woven into the very fabric of her formidable political actions. Number 1. Maria de Molina's unyielding defense. The late 13th and early 14th centuries in Castile were characterized by political instability, rival claims to the throne, and the unchecked ambitions of powerful, noble families. Amidst this treacherous landscape, Maria de Molina, queen consort to Sancho IV, and later queen regent for her son Ferdinand IV, emerged as a figure of remarkable resilience and unyielding determination. Born in 1265, Maria was a woman of noble Castilian lineage, known for her intelligence, piety, and shrewd political acumen. Her life, however, was defined by a constant battle to secure her family's rightful claim to the throne and to defend her young son against a relentless tide of usurpation. Attempts and betrayals, her actions, though often portrayed as defensive, were executed with a ruthless effectiveness that saw her eliminate enemies, outmaneuver rivals, and solidify her dynasty's rule through sheer force of will and strategic retribution. Maria's challenges began even before her husband, Sancho IV. Their marriage itself was controversial due to issues of consanguineship. The familial relationship that required papal dispensation. This lack of clear papal approval for their marriage meant that their children, including their heir apparent, Ferdinand, were considered illegitimate by some factions. This legal vulnerability became a constant weapon in the hands of their rivals. When Sancho IV died in 1295, leaving behind a 9-year-old heir, Ferdinand IV, Maria de Molina found herself thrust into the perilous role of Queen Regent. The kingdom instantly erupted into chaos. Numerous claimants to the throne emerged, primarily the Infantes de la Cerda, the sons of Alfonso X's elder, deceased son, Ferdinand de la Cerda, who argued they were the rightful heirs. Powerful noble houses, eager to expand their own influence and lands, openly sided with these rival claimants, or simply rebelled against the crown. Maria de Molina's first act of fierce self-preservation and retribution against those who challenged her son's legitimacy was to immediately establish her authority as regent. She acted with swift determination, forming alliances with key cities and segments of the nobility, leveraging her personal reputation and political skill. She faced an immediate coalition of powerful figures. Don Juan, her husband's brother, proclaimed himself king, seizing various cities. Alfonso de la Cerda, the principal Infante claimant, received support from France and Aragon. Diego López Valle de Haro, a powerful Biscayan lord, also rebelled, seizing royal lands. Maria found herself isolated, with a young son, and faced with a kingdom fragmenting under the pressure of multiple civil wars. Her response was not to cower, but to fight back with cunning and tenacity. Maria's primary strategy for dealing with her enemies was to divide and conquer. She exploited the rivalries between the various noble factions and claimants, offering concessions and promises to some, while isolating and relentlessly pursuing others. For example, she skillfully negotiated with James II of Aragon, who had initially supported Alfonso de la Cerda. Maria offered territorial concessions and future marriage alliances to detach Aragon from the Infante's cause. This was a masterclass in political maneuvering, turning one enemy into a neutral party, thereby weakening the primary challenger. Her ability to secure papal dispensation for her marriage, years after Sancho's death, by directly negotiating with the Pope, was another crucial victory, legally cementing her son's legitimacy and effectively neutralizing a key argument used by her rivals. Maria also proved herself adept at military command and siege warfare when necessary. While she primarily relied on diplomacy and political pressure, she did not shy away from confronting rebellious nobles with force. When a particularly powerful noble, like Juan Núñez de Lara, raised the banner of revolt, Maria's forces besieged his strongholds. The sieges were protracted and brutal, designed to wear down the resistance and demonstrate the crown's unyielding determination. Her patience and persistence were legendary. She would not let a challenge go unanswered, and those who dared to openly defy her authority often found their castles razed and their lands confiscated. This was a direct, often brutal form of retribution for their disloyalty and threats to her son's throne. Perhaps the most potent aspect of Maria's ruthless defense was her psychological warfare. She nurtured rivalries among her enemies, feeding their suspicions and distrust of each other. She would spread rumors, offer secret pacts, and withdraw support at crucial moments, ensuring that her enemies spent more time fighting among themselves than uniting against her. One particularly striking example was her handling of Don Juan, her brother-in-law, who had proclaimed himself king. While initially a formidable foe, Maria skillfully isolated him by turning other nobles against him and by offering the Infantes de la Cerda concessions that undermined Don Juan's claim. Eventually, Don Juan was forced to submit, giving up his royal pretensions. A public humiliation orchestrated by Maria. This was not a direct execution, but a systematic political annihilation of a rival, leaving him stripped of his power and ambition. Maria de Molina's regency lasted until Ferdinand IV came of age in 1301. But even after he took full control, Maria continued to be his most trusted advisor. She actively helped him manage the volatile nobility and defend the kingdom against external threats. When Ferdinand IV died prematurely in 1312, leaving behind another infant heir, Alfonso XI Maria once again stepped into the role of Queen Regent, sharing power with her son's uncle. The cycle of noble rebellion and internal conflict immediately resumed. Once again, Maria faced down powerful nobles and rival claimants, employing the same ruthless tactics of diplomacy, negotiation, military pressure, and psychological manipulation to protect her grandson's inheritance. Her second regency was just as challenging, but Maria, now older and even more experienced, navigated the treacherous waters with the same unyielding resolve. She faced the great magnates like the Infantes Don Pedro and Don Juan, who constantly vied for power and often threatened to destabilize the kingdom. Maria, through clever alliances and timely concessions, ensured the young Alfonso XI's safety and secured his undisputed ascension to the throne. She strategically neutralized her enemies, often by offering them positions in the Regency Council that bound them to the crown, or by ensuring their downfall if they continued to challenge the legitimate line. Her tenacity ensured that the Castilian monarchy, despite numerous attempts to fragment it, remained intact and under the legitimate rule of her descendants. Maria de Molina's long life was a testament to her ruthless, unyielding determination to defend her family's crown, a continuous act of strategic retribution against any who dared to challenge the sovereignty of her son and grandson.